So let's give her a nice Badger welcome, even though it's sort of a farewell.
Thank you. Thanks, Julie. Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for coming, everyone. I hope it's interesting for you. I'm going to... So this is the title of my talk, essentially, do animals get under our skin? And the whole point of the research that I've been doing is really to sort of try and tease apart some of the impacts that animals have on us, both the biological and the psychosocial. And there's been a lot of research that's been done that I'm going to talk a little bit about in this presentation that has tried to look at these different things, but there's a lot of problems in that research. And there's several of us out there who really feel that animals do a lot to bring a lot of different things into our lives, but because of the things that we're starting to see, we're wondering if there isn't a stronger biological component to that beyond just the sort of oxytocin effect or the cortisol effect that a lot of people have noted with animals. So that was really sort of the focus of the work that I did at the University of Arizona and then here at the University of Wisconsin. And I'm going to talk about those two studies in this presentation. So before I do that, though, I do want to just kind of give you a roadmap of where we're going to go in this presentation in case you get a little lost. So I'll do an introduction of kind of the research, the state of the science in animal-human interaction, and just kind of give you a brief update on where we're at and where we sort of see the field going. And then I'll talk a little bit about my approach to this as a medical anthropologist, which is pretty different than a lot of people like zoologists, anthrozoologists, or ethologists, behaviorists, those kinds of things. Then I'll talk about the two studies that we did at the University of Arizona, the dog study that we did, and I'll present some biological findings as well as some ethnographic findings, which as an anthropologist, I think are the most interesting, personally. The biology is really interesting, but to me, I think the real beauty in what came out of this study was actually the ethnographic findings. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the UW farm study, the study that we did here this summer at Heartland Farm Sanctuary. And then I'm hoping that we can open it up to questions and have a discussion. If you have any thoughts or ideas about the things we've done or questions, I'd love to hear that. So as Julie mentioned, I'm a medical anthropologist. So basically, for folks that don't know, I usually just say that we study the social side of medicine. I'm trained broadly as a biocultural anthropologist and as a biological anthropologist and then a cultural anthropologist. So I kind of put those together and say biocultural. But a medical anthropologist is a subset of that, and we study really very specific things about culture and medicine. So that's really where the heart of my training is, it really focuses on. My background is in clinical trials. I worked for about 10 years in Seattle for a non-governmental organization, and I focused primarily on the development of vaccines and devices for developing countries, so things that underutilized technologies for diseases, a lot of things like Japanese encephalitis, malaria, these sorts of things that these countries need, but that isn't necessarily lucrative for us to be developing in this part of the world. So that's really where my background in clinical trials comes from, and that's why I went to what I call PhD school, because at that point I was pretty late in my career. But I went back and got a degree in anthropology because a lot of the things that we were studying in clinical trials, I felt like we were missing a lot of the pieces of this, the things that I was seeing when I was in the field in places like India, Sri Lanka, Thailand. The things that people were talking to me about in these studies were not necessarily the things that we were studying, and I felt like we were missing a whole host of issues that could have been incorporated into these trials. So that's how I ended up in medical anthropology, fully intending to study clinical trials and do that as my career. In the middle of that, I had an NIH postdoc with the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine. And it really turned a lot of my thinking on its head about how we study clinical trials and medicines in general. And I came to, a lot of my colleagues at the time were studying things like Ayurveda, traditional Chinese medicine, homeopathy, naturopathy. And I was starting to become really interested in this human-animal connection. And it became sort of clear to me at the time that when you have two complex dynamical systems, animals and humans, and you're trying to understand the impact of one on the other, because everything right now is going from animals to humans, we're missing a lot of those pieces. And I thought that at the time, my thinking was that if we could study this in the same ways that people are trying to understand the traditional Chinese medicine and trying to study these systems of medicine, if we could look at animals in that way, it might help us along a little bit further. So that's how I got into sort of studying this. And really, I put this here, the beyond anthropocentrism, because a lot of people in the field that are studying this right now are really interested in sort of what this can do for humans. And they're putting humans at the center of all of this. And I, as an anthropologist, sort of always joke that I'm a bad anthropologist, because my focus really isn't on the animal, or isn't on the humans, it's on the animals, and how this work can help us sort of move animal health forward, how we can help some of the species extinctions that we're having, how we can get policy changed around these sorts of things so that we're not just helping humans, but also helping animals. So I bring a sort of broad perspective to this, a biocultural perspective where I use mixed methods and ethnography. And I've been really lucky in my career to work with Dr. Charles Raison, who's here at this university, because he really understands, he has a background in anthropology himself, and he really understands the importance of anthropology in these studies, and using not just sort of biological measures, but also ethnography to try and really tease apart some of these things that are going on. So I focus again on evidence-based data on the animal-human bond. I really want to bring sort of an interdisciplinary approach to this. And in the studies that I've worked on, we've worked with psychologists, ethologists, geriatricians, pediatricians. We have a really broad swath of people that we work with. And my work is really community-based. I always try to partner with an organization that's in the community so that our work can actually go back and either help them increase their own funding, improve their programming, that sort of thing. So that's really the focus of the work that I do and what I try to do in my research. So where are we with the state of science? Hal Herzog, and I'm sure there's some people in the room who've actually read a lot of the stuff that he's done. He actually just hit a big milestone in his career, 100 blog posts on Psychology Today. And I really enjoy Hal's work because he looks at the science that's coming out of the animal-human interaction field very, very critically. And he is probably the main critic right now on this work. And his point, very well taken, is that the existence of a generalized pet effect on human mental and physical health is at present not a fact, but an unsubstantiated hypothesis. And what he means by this is that a lot of the studies haven't been done very well. They have small n's, they don't have control groups, they maybe haven't used a lot of the most rigorous methods that they could. And another large problem in this field that people don't talk about, but I think should be brought to attention, is the fact that it's very difficult to measure how animals are feeling, how they're doing. And a lot of the questionnaires on this and trying to get at these sort of impacts between animals and humans haven't been validated, and they're not reliable. So they're very difficult to sort of use across studies. So the studies are all using a wide variety, and there's no real sort of standardization at this point. So there's a lot of literature reviews that have been done, meta-analyses, scientific reports, and basically the gist of this right now is that it just lacks evidence on animal-human bonds, sort of like what animals are doing for humans and whatnot, as well as the vice versa. And so there's a large sort of movement right now to actually sort of increase what's happening, and the NIH put out an RFP this year. A lot of people applied for it because it's pretty much the only one aside from the HABRI. So aside from the fact that we have all of these methodological problems in this field, we also face a problem that there's very, very little funding for this work. So I kind of have gone over this a little bit, but just to sort of reiterate, my focus really is on helping change policy around I have a master's in public policy, and so really trying to use the science that we are gaining from these studies to go back in and say, okay, how can we better the lives of humans and animals? And here this is kind of the long game, but looking down the line at things like Can we get insurance companies to pay for the pet food of an older couple so that they don't have to give up their pet, or get their veterinary care so that they can keep their animal? Can we actually get some science and some data in that shows that these things are beneficial to people so that we can get some of these things changed? So the background for the two studies here, the science on the microbes, germs, and and health, loss of contact. This is the old friends hypothesis here. And the idea here is essentially, I'm sure you've all heard this, that as we've moved from sort of developing nations or our historical way of life into our modern way of life, we've become hyper clean, hyper hygienic, and we've lost contact with a lot of the bacteria that essentially the old friends that keep our guts and our skin and our sort of systems healthy. And the data for this is pretty robust. It's coming out of a lot of when folks are moving, either refugees or immigrants from developing countries into the United States, their rates of autoimmune and atopic disorders skyrocket when they come into developed countries. There's also been really robust data that's been done on people who've lived on farms. A lot of this comes out of Amish societies, and looking at the rates of these same types of disorders and how they're so much lower. And the thought there is that they're really exposed to the feces, the mud, the bacteria that these animals on a day-to-day basis are bringing into their lives. So there also is a bidirectional relationship between the microorganism loss and psychiatric disorders, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that on this slide here. When we're talking about exposure to dogs and farms, so I want to be a little bit careful when I say this, the data shows that exposure to dogs and farms really does sort of enrich our microbiomes. And then the farm and the interactions with dogs also shows that there's decreases in atopic and immune disorders. And a lot of this data is actually coming out of really young children. So when Julie asked me to give this presentation, I kind of hesitated a little bit because my main study is really in older adults. But a lot of the science that we're basing our research on comes out of children. And here we're not just talking about children ages, from 1 to 3. The data here is in the first 100 days of life. So we're really talking about that early exposure to these germs. And what's more interesting, I think, is that it's also being shown in prenatal exposure. So if a woman is exposed to farms, to animal bacteria, a dog in the home, prior to giving birth, then the child even has stronger immune and atopic, the systems are much more sort of robust against these things. So the bidirectional relationships between immune conditions that are associated with the loss of old friends organisms are associated with a range of psychiatric disorders. And this here, I'm just going to give a couple of examples. So for emotional and behavioral problems like anxiety and depression, children with these types of depression and anxiety have a much higher rate of atopic disorders. And then atopic dermatitis in infants and toddlers is significantly increased the likelihood of autism spectrum disorder. And then I have a list here, which I won't go through and bore you, but the science on this is really strong. So it's suggesting that these immune disorders that people are having are related to these psychiatric disorders. And although it hasn't been, we don't have necessarily that causation link defined right now, the psychiatric disorders being connected to these immune disorders and these immune disorders being connected to the microbiome loss, we believe that this is all connected together. And then dysbiosis in the gut microbiome is implicated in a range of psychiatric disorders, as I mentioned, but also physical disorders. And the list here goes on, but to give you an idea, MS, IBD, obesity and metabolic disorders, asthma, autism, atherosclerosis. So it's a range of things that the gut and this sort of lack of robust or healthy microbiome is implicated in all of these different things. So knowing all of this, and then also knowing that as people age, their microbiome, the diversity and the richness of their microbiome depletes, we sort of had this idea to do a study in older people to look at whether or not we could sort of show the same sorts of changes happening in children that are exposed to these animals in older adults. So this is kind of, we take all of this together, and this is kind of where it led us to. So the UA dog study that we did, essentially our question here was, can companion dogs improve the physical and emotional health of older individuals by acting as a probiotic delivery system? And our main objectives to examine the degree to which positive bacteria increase in both humans and canines, to examine whether a dog enhances emotional and physical well-being of older adults, whether having a dog reduces inflammation in older adults, and whether there's any improvements in health and well-being that can be correlated with the microbiota or the inflammation changes. So the study was conducted between March and September of 2015. We did this with individuals ages 50 to 80. We had that many. We had our youngest participant, I think, was about 55, and our oldest was 79. So really the entire range. And you could not have had a dog or been on antibiotics in the last 6 months to be in the study. Antibiotics actually kind of like wipe the gut clean, so it's a really important piece of what we did to make sure that they have a strong baseline. Again, you'll see here, you're probably laughing because I just talked about all of the problems in this field and the small n's and these sorts of things, and here we had an n of 17. And it's not lost on me, but our intention here was actually to do a pilot study and then to take this data and actually say, okay, we have some sort of a signal here, let's apply for more funding to actually do a larger scale study. So in the study, it was a really cool design because we actually had people foster a dog from the Humane Society of Southern Arizona for 3 months. And I just want to kind of point out here that, again, this is my focus on the community partnerships, but we had a lot of people that said to us, and I'll get to this in a little bit later in the slides, a lot of people said, anybody who's over the age of 50 who wants a dog already has a dog. So this study is never going to fly, good luck with this. And we actually found, and I'll talk about this, that's not actually the case at all. In fact, people in this age range really wanted dogs. They came to us and we actually had to turn a lot of people away. And even to this day, I have a lot of friends I made friends with the people in the study, and they have friends who want to get into a study like this so that they can get a dog and have the same sorts of support. So this is a little bit difficult to see, but these were all of the methods, and just kind of put it up here as a way of noting that, we did some biological measures between the fecal, the buccal, and the skin swabs to look at the microbiome. We also did immune function in these folks via blood samples. We weren't allowed to do it in the dogs because the Humane Society has a rule against their animals being in any sort of research studies, and they actually granted us an exclusion for this study because we weren't going to do anything like that, and that it could actually benefit them. And then the ethnographic pieces here, and you're going to see some kind of strange things here. Is it on this slide? I thought it was, but maybe it isn't. Oh, yes, it is. So analysis of emails written to me following media coverage. So I'm going to point this out because I'm actually going to talk about it later in the presentation, but we had one newspaper study get written about this study, a newspaper article get written about this study. And all of a sudden, before we knew it, we had people from all over the world contacting us, wanting to know more about the study, wanting to reprint the study. And then I had people from all over the world contacting me to tell me about their study, their own experiences with their dogs, and could they, call me and be a part of the research through their stories. So I went back to the IRB and got approval to do that. So I interviewed a number of these people from across the globe and got their really interesting stories about what they think about dogs and saliva and how animals impact our health. And as an anthropologist, for me, that was a gold mine. So this is the basic study design. I think the most important thing to kind of point out is this baseline 1 and baseline 2. Because the microbiota can change on a daily basis, it really fluctuates pretty rapidly and wildly, we needed to have sort of a strong baseline. So we did one week before and then a week in between where they weren't exposed to the dog and the dog was still at the Humane Society, and I did the sampling on the dogs there. And then at this point here, they did another sampling, and that was we sort of aggregated that data and got a strong look at what the baseline really looked like for these people. So this was what our collaborators in the microbiome field had suggested to us to do. And then right before they got their dog, where their dog was introduced to them, they came to the clinic and they had their blood drawn. They did a bunch of questionnaires. We did a frailty test with them. We did a whole number of things. Should also point out in this study that they wore an activity monitor, and they took, there was a group on campus that did a pretty intense 3-day dietary collection, intake collection with them, where they had to remember and recall everything that they had eaten in the last 24 hours. And they did that 3 times a week, 4 times during the study. Obviously, because your diet can really affect your microbiome. And so everything we did to the humans, we did to the dogs, except for the immune measures, as I mentioned. So the dogs also wore a little activity monitor on their collar called a whistle. And it was pretty hysterical because I had it connected to my phone, and every time, a dog would have significant activity, I'd get an update on, Yankee went, for a walk today, or so. It was real-time data. So then we repeated that at month 1, 2, and 3 to actually see how this was changing over time. And again, this is another criticism in the field, is that, it's not sort of a long-term follow-up, but again, we were really trying to look at something here to get some data that might be able to help us move forward. So this is Yankee, one of the study dogs, and all of the dogs here are study dogs in this presentation. So here are the results from the microbiome, the beta and alpha diversity. This is the humans, and you're going to see here, so the skin, the mouth, and the stool, and then this is the alpha diversity. So, how much is the actual diversity of the microbes in the person's gut, actually, and their skin and their mouth changing. And you can see here, there's really not any change over time. There's not much to show in this slide. So unfortunately, that's the take home there, is we really didn't see anything. Seems to not want to work. Okay. So then the beta and alpha diversity in the dog, it's sort of the same thing. Really not seeing much of a change anywhere here with the diversity. And then here is the human and the dog overlapping. And I'm not sure if you can see this. Okay, so here, it looks like they're starting to overlap here a little bit in both of these. But when you actually talk to the microbiome experts, what they say is that this isn't really changing. These are where the baseline were. So, in some cases, a dog and a human are going to share similar microbes just because we do. And it doesn't have necessarily anything to do with the fact that they're in our homes or not. So pre and post, there was some similarity between the bacteria that the dogs and the humans were sharing, but it doesn't mean that it changed over time. So here is where it actually gets interesting for us, is the immune function. We looked at IL-6, TNF-alpha, and then IL-1 beta. And the TNF-alpha and the IL-1 beta didn't really change that much in the study. But the IL-6 actually decreased significantly, and this was statistically significant even in our N of 17. So what this actually means is, this is a pretty important finding actually, because IL-6, as it increases, and it actually does naturally increase in older populations, but as it increases, you're going to see a lot more illnesses like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, immune function start to really deplete. So this is one of the markers that doctors really look at in older populations to see sort of generally how their health is doing and how they might actually improve things for them. So it's a good marker of general sort of health of where people are going. So the fact that we saw a significant decrease with dogs here was a pretty important finding, actually. So like I said, we did a whole host of psychosocial well-being questionnaires. I'm going to report on the ones where we saw something interesting. The rest you can just assume that we didn't see anything interesting. So in depression, the IDSSR, the Inventory of Depressive Symptomatology by Self-Report, this is a questionnaire that is validated and found to be reliable. It's what they use in the majority of psychiatric studies, actually. You can look at the literature, and this is one of the ones that is out there, very widely used. Dr. Razan uses this in most of his studies, so that's why we used it here. And you do see the changes in this over time from baseline to month 3. And these were statistically significant. I didn't bring the p-values, but we did see statistical significance here. The same thing with the WHO-5. This is one that you want to see changes that go positively. So you can see sort of that bump in between month 2 and 3. It's not really going anywhere, but then all of a sudden it hits up. So it's, and then the SF-36, this measures 36 questions that cover, I think, 9 domains. And they're written down here: physical functioning, energy, fatigue. So even though we didn't see statistical changes here, either in the full measure itself or in these sub-measures, we did actually see changes that started to go in the right direction for people. So this was, even though it wasn't statistically significant, this is actually a pretty important slide here showing that there were changes in all of the things that you'd want to see changing. So now, looking at the correlation, so I do want to point out that these aren't, we've sort of redone this a little bit. So these slides are a little bit old. I don't have the new ones, but it doesn't change very much, because what you'd want to see is more of a correlation, obviously coming closer to the line in both of these. The IL-6 and the IDSSR on this side, and then the IL-6 and WHO-5 on that side. So you are seeing that they're starting to kind of go together, but there wasn't statistical significance here. So as IL-6 drops, the WHO-5 does increase, and as IL-6 drops here, then the IDSSR is also changing in the right direction, but unfortunately not statistical significance. So what did we actually see then? What's the summary of this study? No positive changes in the human microbiota, so kind of a bummer for us because we were really hoping for that. We did see important changes in a key marker of inflammation, so that was a win. Statistically significant changes in a couple of key psychosocial well-being, so that another win for us. But then, no correlations on the IL-6 and the psychosocial. So overall, we saw some good things. It was interesting. Not necessarily enough to get us to the next level of getting funding for another study, but interesting nonetheless. And I think the IL-6 here is important and can be used by future researchers to kind of look at this sorts of things. I will say that the NIH grant that went out, the round that went out this spring, I know several people were looking at microbiome stuff in animals, so it's possible that other studies are going to be coming out looking at this sort of thing in the future. So now I kind of want to talk a little bit about the ethnographic findings in the study. So overall, we saw that there was a strong perception that dogs are clean and healthy, good for humans. And that there actually were some positive impacts of pairing with dogs with seniors. So people really believe that dogs' mouths are clean. They really, really do. And this is not true of other animals. So not to diss cats, because I told Julie I wouldn't do that. But we had participants in this study who had cats at home already when they had the dog, because that wasn't something we looked at as an exclusion factor. And it was very, very telling to me in all of the interviews I did, because these people would let their dogs lick them, they'd let them lick their dish, I mean, it didn't matter. And then they would say, well, so do you let your cat do that? And they would look at me like I had 3 heads. I mean, like, why would you ever let a cat lick your dish or your hand, or like, what is wrong with you? So they really, really feel that there's something different about dogs. So I'm going to put up some quotes from people in the study that I took from the interviews. So this is from John, and he was actually in our study. So he got a dog, a little dog, Muffins. We'll remember Muffins. She was one of my favorites. But John said to me, a lot of people think that dogs are dirty. Bullshit. That dog and his mouth are cleaner than you are, and I really believe that. So you can see I had a lot of fun with these people because they were a fun group of people. So this is Xander, and this is Xander's story. All names have been changed, by the way. So the story here is that Xander lives in Australia, and his son has a very, very severe, had a very, very severe case of eczema. And he was very, very troubled by this, started doing some research. It looked like maybe a dog might help, so they got a dog and a puppy and brought it into the family. And when we were talking, you know, this is what he said to me. My 4-year-old son started mimicking the puppy by licking the dog's tongue. Yeah, that's pretty gross, but I was completely fascinated. I started reading on fecal transplants and support my wacky theory. The more I read, the more I really believed that it was because of the puppy. And we now have a 4-year-old boy who is eczema-free, and I'm so relieved for him. And I mean, this was a father who was, you know, like in tears on the phone because his son had the eczema that was cracking, and it was incredibly painful. And to now have a son who doesn't have this, he really attributes it to the dog. So pretty interesting case study there. So Eddie and Dr. Bailey, I'm not going to show you the pictures because my friends, actually when I presented this as part of my dissertation data, they told me that I couldn't present these pictures. So I don't anymore. I don't think they're very graphic, but anyway, Eddie was about, I think, 76 years old, and he had basal cell carcinoma on his hand. He lived in Tucson. And so he'd had to have an operation, and about this much of his hand, you know, they'd had to remove this cancer from his hand, and it was pretty raw, really raw skin. And he, you know, his doctor had him keep the bandage on, change out the bandage, take your, you know, antibiotics, and I really want you to come back and get, you know, some plastic surgery. And you know, he was kind of like playing along. He wasn't sure about the antibiotics, but he was, you know, kind of going with it. And over time, it was like a few days into it, his dogs, I think he lived with 4 huskies. His dogs were really interested. One in particular, the female, was very interested in his wound. And whenever he would try be cleaning it, she would come over and nudge his hand and want to lick his wound. And he was like, whoa, you can't lick my wound. Like, this is, you know. But then, you know, the dog wouldn't let up. And so he got on the internet. This is another one of the cases where people are self-diagnosing and things on the internet. And he looked up all of the information he could find on whether or not it would be bad to let his dog lick his wound. And he went back to his doctor, and he told his doctor that he really thought that his dog could help him if he let her lick the wound. And the doctor said, do not do this. You know, don't do this at home. And, you know, take your antibiotics, come in, get your skin grafting done, and, you know, like this will all be good. Like, dogs' mouths have some bacteria in them that could really be problematic. They could cause an infection at your age, etc. And, you know, being a guy from the West, you know, like the Wild West, Eddie went home and he just had a case of, I'm not going to listen to that doctor. So he didn't, and he proceeded to let Dr. Bailey, as he now calls her, lick his hand. And it went on, it was about 3 times a day, you know, like 5 or 6 minutes a day, he would let her just lick and lick and lick the wound. And over about an 8-week period, his wound completely healed, and it almost looks like, when you see the pictures, you almost can't even see that there was, you know, anything there to begin with. So he is convinced, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this dog healed his wound. So another story. The next story that I'm going to put up is a woman named Maureen, whose husband was a postal carrier in Phoenix. I promised Maureen when I talked to her that every time I gave a presentation or I published on my work that her story would be included, because I think that it is an important cautionary tale to all of the other stories that I heard. 95% great about dogs and their saliva, and there was, you know, a couple that were negative. And Maureen's husband had always let their dog lick scratches on him, and she was pretty annoyed with it. She didn't like it. She wished that he hadn't done it. But, you know, it was his body. She had to sort of let it go. And then one day, their dog got into a fight with their neighbor's dog. And he went over and he broke them apart. And he didn't get bit, but he got scratched up pretty badly. And she was very clear to tell me he did not get bit. So about, I think, a week or 2 later, he got very, very sick, and he ended up in the hospital. And he ended up dying from essentially sepsis. And when they did the autopsy on him, the doctors called back and they said, do you have a dog? And did he get bit by a dog? And she said, well, we have a dog, and told the story of the fight. And it was because they saw C. canomorsus in his blood work, or in his lab results. And essentially, C. canomorsus is one of the ones that is naturally found in dog and cat saliva and can be very dangerous for people with immunocompromised systems, especially people who have drinking problems. She told me very clearly he did not have a drinking problem, so she wanted me to be, to know that. But something here was going on, and she and her family now believe that it wasn't necessarily the dog itself, but the way his body sort of reacted to that bacteria. And so this is also really interesting from a medical anthropologist's perspective, because we kind of look at drugs and how our bodies react to these things over time. And so what might have been going on here is interesting. But I always am very, it's important to me to be very, to honor Maureen's story, because she really wanted me to make sure that this got out to people. So, and I think it's important too, because in the last few years we've started to see in the news a lot of studies or a lot of articles come out about how people, this sort of connection between dog saliva and health. And there's some doctors that will say, don't ever do that, blah, blah, blah. And other people are like Eddie and Dr. Bailey. So I think it's just a good reminder. So what are some of the benefits that we saw of dogs in older age in this study? These are actual quotes from people in the study. So I now have a purpose, a reason to get out of bed. I meet more people, we laugh more, we don't fight as much. These were just kind of things that people said to me all the time, and I presented some of these results at a veterinary conference in Portland, where they were kind of looking at the interactions between animals. And there the focus was really heavy on the science, and sort of like, we don't have enough science, we don't have what we need to show that animals are good for human health. And I at the end of my presentation, I just said, bullet number 3 here, I will not ever be able to figure out how you measure that. I can't. How did I ever smile before I met her? To me, that's one of those things that we can look at the biology of all of this, and we can look at how animals are impacting us on one level. But we may never actually be able to understand what is truly going on with animals. And there was a reporter that interviewed Chuck and I, Dr. Raison and I, for an article a few months ago. And he said to me, this is really interesting research. I really want to, get it out there and let people know about your work. But I'm kind of conflicted, because at the end of the day, isn't it just sort of great that our dogs make us feel better? And do we need to know what the magic behind that is? And it really kind of sat with me, that is sort of like, well, maybe in some ways, that's the important piece, is that these animals make us feel better, and we don't, necessarily understand it, or do we need to understand it? But then I always kind of go back to that policy piece of things and think, well, in some ways, we're not going to ever be able to make the lives of animals better in the ways that we want if we don't have this data. So it's kind of how I keep it in my head. So in terms of barriers to dog ownership in your senior years, these were some of the things that we heard from people. That it's too much work, too little support, they're afraid they're going to die before the dog, that their spouse is unsupportive, the cost of food, and some seniors have a hard time putting food on their tables. How can they afford to feed a dog? And our study actually offered some of these things to them. So we had a 2-level support system. We had a really great dog trainer down in Tucson who's actually, now he's won America's Best Trainer 2 years in a row. I mean, this guy is superb. And then we had an emotional support person, which was myself. So any questions they had, and I mean, seniors will call you at all hours of the night. It does, they don't care if you're sleeping and their dog just peed on their carpet. So I think this is why I have so many friends from this study, because, and then we did provide veterinary care for the first few months of the study for their animals, and then food donations, because we wanted the dogs to all be on the same chow. And we did this interesting thing, and Will Palmer here is a student at SOHI this year. he was part of this group that would meet with the seniors and go to their homes, and you'd go to their homes and you'd think you were just going for a short visit, and you'd be there for an hour or 2 hours because they wanted to give you food, they wanted you to go for a walk with their dog, and it just kind of became one of these things that we realized. If you could get these sorts of things into a program for senior citizens at humane societies, especially in the Southwest where you have such a high population of snowbirds moving in, you could really change the face of dog adoption and dog foster in these places. So maybe we didn't have the biological results we wanted to find, but I think we have some pretty good data to put a funding application forward. And that's one of the things I'll be doing when I go back to Tucson, is working with the Humane Society there to get this sort of thing up and running. So yeah. So now I just kind of want to switch gears a little bit and talk briefly about the farm study. The farm study stood for, I may need some help with this. Farms, adolescents, and what's that?
Farms, animals, adolescents.
That's it. Microbiome. So farms, animals, and adolescents, reinforcing the microbiome. So we're kind of lucky that we found this acronym here. Some of the data on here is a little bit old, and I'll explain that at the end. But essentially, our goals were to enroll 40 kids ages 7 to 13 who attend either 2 to 3 weeks of summer camp. This ended up being 1, 2, or 3 weeks of summer camp for recruitment reasons. Heartland Farm Sanctuary is pretty neat. I don't know if any of you have been out there. Yeah, it's a pretty special place. It's out on Midtown Road in Verona. I'll just plug them for a second. They are having an open house next weekend, is it Saturday the 23rd or Sunday? Anyway, it's the 23rd for sure. Between, I think, 2 and 5, they're having an open house. If you want to go see what a farm sanctuary is all about, it's a good time to see it. It's a good time to take your kids. So they have an immersive humane education camp there, and humane education is something that is a wider program that's going on across the United States. It's an actual curriculum that Humane Society has developed, a Humane Society in a couple of other places. And it's a traditional farming environment, and what we mean by this is that it doesn't have pesticides. It's not a large bio-agribusiness, so you don't see like huge numbers of cows being milked on this land. It's a small farm that you might have seen, sort of near the turn of the century United States. So our overarching questions here were, can a time-limited exposure to a traditional farm environment increase beneficial gut bacteria, enhance emotional well-being? Sorry, go back to there. Okay, sorry, it just wants to switch. So these were the main overall questions that we had. I've had to take a few out of here because we had a lot of recruitment issues in this study. So we were at first looking at cortisol levels to try and get a sense of how this might be changing with kids. And we also were gonna look at some of their immune function through their saliva. So we weren't gonna take blood from children, but measure these things through the saliva. And as it turns out that kids are a lot less willing to talk about their digestive tract issues and their fecal, to give you their fecal samples than senior citizens, who will talk hours on end about these things with you. So we had to kind of do some quick scrambling in about the end of May before the study went completely upended on us. So we did change, and we ended up only doing a nasal sample and a fecal sample, and then psychosocial well-being questionnaires. We took out all of the ethnography. So as an anthropologist, this is very difficult for me, but we made the decision to do it. So it's problematic for me and very sad because I won't have anything to sort of write up on that piece of it. So it was kids who came to camp between May, or the study would be conducted between May and September. As it was really July and September. 7 to 13, they couldn't have been on an antibiotic in the last 4 weeks, which I think we actually changed. What's that? 4 weeks? Okay, so for 4 weeks, this morning we said 3 months. So no significant exposure to farm animals either. And we ended up losing a lot of kids in Wisconsin in this area about that because turns out a lot of children in this area go to farm or go to a horse camp. So So as you can see, I pared this down. We had a lot more that we were doing, but these were the things we ended up doing at the end, except for the skin sample. So we didn't do a skin sample. Did just the fecal and the nasal samples. So here is the basic study design. And again, we looked at that baseline. We actually did it 2 weeks here because of the kids that were coming in for 2 weeks. We would be able to compare their data. But then we did post-camp follow-up and then a month later. We were planning in this study to do a 3-month follow-up as well, and that actually had to fall away. So the last child in this study will be followed up in September 29th, in a few weeks. So here's where we are. We had a lot of problems with recruitment and retention of participants, as just naturally happens. And I think that was a huge lesson learned for us. When we had originally started talking about doing a study here at SOHI, we're talking about doing a dog study in the preschool, and we had engaged a lot of the people who have this expertise in children and sort of doing studies in children. And I think that's where we made the error here, to be totally frank and honest with you, is that we didn't utilize the expertise that we have here in SOHI to actually tell us these things. Because when we started to look at some of the problems that we were having, especially around the fecal sample collection, and we would talk to somebody just down the hall, like Janine Dilworth-Bart, she would say to us, well, why don't you just do this? And why don't you, and it's so intuitive to parents. But nobody on our team, with the exception of Chuck, has children. So we didn't really think through these things, and thinking about, our last study being so simple in seniors, we didn't anticipate these issues. So there were, of course, other issues that we had, but, methodologically, those are some of the important ones that I think, from a group, as I stand here talking to people who have a lot of expertise and a lot of students that are learning these things, really talk to each other when you can, and really reach out to each other, because some of the best knowledge that you have is probably in the person sitting next to you. So again, we had these significant changes to the protocol, and unfortunately we only had 11 kids that were enrolled. The last subject will be 9/29, like I mentioned. Data analysis in October, probably have some results about mid-November, we're thinking. So we talked this morning to the board, and they're interested in kind of seeing where we are, what we get with the data, and how we might move forward. If we want to do another round of data collection next summer, that's a possibility. And kind of like these lessons learned that I mentioned. There's more, clearly, but those are the main ones. And I'm happy to share any of the lessons we learned, so that if anybody ever decides to do a study like this in the future, if you can learn from the mistakes that we made, I am more than happy to share with you. So just special thanks to the folks on this slide. In particular, I want to thank Dana Berry and Heartland staff. Without Dana Berry, who was the executive director, she's now stepped down, but without her, this never would have been possible. She really had a vision for the farm and what we could help in terms of bringing the data for that. So really thankful to her for that. So with that, we'll just kind of open it up to questions or comments, a discussion. So.